Afternoon, everyone. Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Decoding Workplace Risk and Integrity, using risk scales, indices, and profiles to understand counterproductive work behavior this afternoon. We are pleased to have two excellent presenters on the topic, Ms. Lisi Mallinson and Dr. Pakiza Rajab. Dr. Rajab is a senior researcher at JVR Psychometrics. She has extensive experience applying psychometric results across various sectors, including schools, private practice, higher education, and corporate environments. Her work significantly contributes to the advancement of psychometrics and its application in various contexts. Our second presenter, Ms. Lisi Mallinson, is a distinguished lecturer at Stellenbosch University. She holds a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology and has a passion for leveraging data to unlock human potential. Her diverse experience spans the legal sector and organizational consulting, focusing on design, development, research, and people analytics. Driven by a commitment to learning and development, Lisi is dedicated to empowering individuals to navigate work and study complexities, ultimately fostering a more productive and fulfilling work environment. So now that we know a little bit more about our presenters, let's find out what it is that they'll share with us this afternoon. Pakiza, over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This afternoon is being recorded because it is a CPD webinar, but more about that later. We will share an email tomorrow with the CPD questionnaire and a few other resources that might come in handy. But I think beyond getting a free CPD point, what is the purpose of this afternoon? From my side, I'll be very brief. I will quickly be taking you through an introduction to the risk if you aren't already familiar with it, how it can be used to identify behavioral risk, as well as, despite it having norms that is largely generalizable, how we can still interpret these scales and our indices with some contextual nuance. Looking at prevalence rates, looking at benchmarks, looking at industry trends that we are picking up. And then I think the absolute beauty of today's webinar will be the very interesting analysis that Lisi has independently done as part of her master's research at Stellenbosch University, looking at the risk and how latent profile analysis reveals certain personality profiles and counterproductive work behavior trends. And then also, I mean, most of us are so familiar with the big five personality traits, but how the risk and the big five actually interact with each other and together help predict risk-related profile membership. So very excited about that part of the webinar. And then lastly, we'll close off with some implications for more targeted and preventative HR and risk strategies. We are going to aim to talk fast enough, but slow enough that you get maximum value, but fast enough that we at least have 10 minutes or so for interaction, because I think this topic is so pertinent. We would love to hear your views on this as well. So just starting on a very glum note, and I think it's, again, maybe relevant given the conversation our dear president had with the president of America yesterday that is trending on social media. But if we're looking at South Africa and corruption and crime as a whole, South Africa is ranked 82nd on the 2024 Corruption Perception Index. This does indicate that our general communities, our general population, perceive a lot of corruption in the public sector. If we're looking at what the World Bank says, so we don't yet have 2024 stats and reports yet, but they have estimated that crime costs South Africa up to 10% of our GDP. That is almost 700 billion rand. Yet, as dire as that sounds, most counterproductive work behavior actually happens below the radar and show who is engaging in them. And when we do identify that these are naughty employees, it's often too late. It's often when we have to already deal with the consequences rather than being a little bit more proactive about it. Thinking about slightly less severe forms of counterproductive work behavior, if we're looking at Occupational Care South Africa's report, they noted that absenteeism costs our economy almost 16 billion rand a year. They also found that almost 50% of our medical certificates that we as employees submit in support of our sick leave are actually fraudulent. So now you might be thinking that, you know what, in your organization, maybe this isn't as bad. Maybe my organization doesn't actually have this type of counterproductive behavior, but maybe it does. So I think as I go through the next slide, Sandra will be just putting up a poll. Who is familiar with the risk? And are you actually concerned about counterproductive behavior in your organization? Right, I'll give you a few seconds. Yes.
While our attendees are answering the poll, I see Kathleen Robertson's hand is up. Kathleen, do you have a question?
I don't think they can unmute themselves.
Let's see if I can unmute. Kathleen, I'll get to your question. Give me a second.
Yes, I think put it in the chat and we will get to it in a second. Right, continue answering the poll if you haven't already. But if we're just now thinking about counterproductive work behavior, what I have on this slide is quite serious, right? We're talking crime, corruption, fraud, sabotage, serious stuff. But suddenly, when I start asking, if you look at your organization, do you have colleagues that fit some of these adjectives that we have on screen? Are they argumentative? Can they sometimes come across as somewhat aggressive? Do they challenge every single comment you have? Do they feel overly dependent on management sign-off or management approval? If something goes wrong, do they blame others? Do they become overly moody? Do they just not follow any rules whatsoever, breaking the rules just for the fun of it? These behaviors, while at first glance we might not feel this is like, you know, stuff for corruption perception indices, can still create uncomfortable workspaces. This is not creating the most comfortable team work environments. And then if we need to look at the risk, I wonder if it's time that we close the polls quickly before I bore you all to death with what the risk is, if you all are familiar with it. Right, I'm just waiting for the results. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see it, but yes, 70% of you are currently not using the risk. So I'm quickly going to give a brief overview of what the risk is. For the 24 of you who are familiar, just deal with me. I'll try to be quick. And again, I think the majority of us are on the call this afternoon because we are worried about counterproductive performance. And I mean, this is a CPD webinar, so by no means are we trying to market the risk, but it is a tool that can possibly be used to just flag possible counterproductive behavior. So if we're looking, what is the risk? Thank you, Sandra, for the poll. So what is the risk? It is a covert personality-based counterproductive workplace behavior measure. What I mean by covert is, well, it's the opposite of overt. And your overt assessments would ask you point blank, have you ever stolen a pen from work? Or have you driven along even though the traffic light was red? So openly and very clearly asking you, have you done something that you probably shouldn't have? The difference with the risk is in that it's covert, because it's personality based, if you're completing it, it kind of feels as if you are completing any normal personality questionnaire, which in today's world, we all complete so many of them. You would answer the risk like you would any Big Five or occupational personality style of questionnaire. What we have found also with the risk, which just adds to this covert or supports that it is covert, is that it functions similarly when done for selection and development. So what that means is whether it's like your high stakes type of assessment, you completing the assessment to get the job, or whether you're completing it purely for development, even though the risk doesn't have a social desirability scale or impression management scale in and of itself, we can kind of say, or at least preliminarily, that it's kind of inbuilt in the questionnaire, that it works the same. People are not falsely putting forward a positive impression just because it is for selection. We've also found that for the most part, it does function similarly across all organizational levels. If we are looking at completion and item difficulty, it does work across all organizational levels. What we do, however, find, and I will show that in a little bit, is upon further t-tests and ANOVA's analysis of variance, we do find slight mean differences depending on the job level and the industry within which the person is working. But we will share those benchmarks shortly. Very briefly then, from a psychometric perspective, if we look at the risk profiles, I'll show you a sample report. We highlight individuals who are in the high risk of displaying certain counterproductive behaviors. These cutoffs were determined by quantile regressions by Professor Casper van Zyl as part of his PhD when he developed the risk. And he also investigated this predictive relationship between the risk scales as we know them and have them in our reports and counterproductive criteria, both organizational and interpersonal. The risk was first launched in 2016, but it has undergone numerous updates over the years. I think it's such a prevalent construct that we keep updating and relooking. And our latest norm update was done in 2023 with almost 20,000 people, 19,538. So a very generalizable, large sample, nice Black representation, nice male representation. But I mean, if you're comparing Black to white and male to female, it's almost equal. Excellent psychometric properties. Reliabilities, validities, all there. We also submitted it to Assessment Standards South Africa, and they've also certified it. So that's great. It's on the HPCSA list as well. Scalar invariance was also achieved, and in looking at cross-group differences, we found no differences really at ethnic group or gender group differences or purpose groups. Like I said above, selection or development, the risk works the same for everyone. We also found high convergence, and Lisi will speak about this in a little bit when she talks about the Big Five, but we also found high convergence between the multidimensional indices of the risk and the hair psychopathy index. Now, what I'm definitely not saying is that the risk is a clinical assessment in any means, and please don't use it as such. It's not. It's been normed and it's meant for everyday use in normal working organizational settings. It is not a clinical tool. However, it is interesting to note, and the flags are there for a reason. These indices are there for a reason because of these correlations with the hair psychopathy index, that if you find a candidate is flagging on these indices, to probe further. Don't call them a psychopath, because they're not. That's not what the risk is telling us. But do probe further, look at other assessments, possibly complete more assessments with them before adding them or including them in the organization, making that selection decision. For those who then aren't familiar, the risk has 12 primary scales. So aggression, that is your extent to which you struggle to manage your aggression. And this can come out both verbally and physically. And especially that physical aggression, we definitely don't want colleagues hitting each other or physically harming another colleague. Callous affect, this is the degree to which you just don't care about your colleagues. I think no individual really, unless you're working in like a sole practice as an entrepreneur, works completely by yourself. And this callous effect can really impact teamwork if you are just indifferent to everybody in your team. Cynicism, the degree to which you believe others are insincere or dishonest or out if they're wanting to help you, it's not because they're actually a nice colleague. It's what do they want out of it? So a very cynical, skeptical perspective on life. Egotism, this is the extent to which you have an inflated sense of self. Now, egotism to a degree can just be confidence, right? So, especially as we move higher up job levels, we often do find higher egotism. And to an extent, it's fine because we do want confident individuals. But again, because we have those quantile regressions in place, as soon as you move above that 80th percentile, we have to think about this egotism. Is this individual maybe going to put themselves before the rest of the team? External locus of control, just not taking own responsibility for what's happening in their life. If something goes wrong, it's outside influences, it is luck or lack thereof. Impulsivity, the degree to which you delay or resist immediate gratification. So if you are high on impulsivity, the chances of you actually thinking through the consequences of your actions quite low, especially in your high stakes or high risk environments. Think mining, for example, or healthcare. You definitely don't want impulsive people. You want them to think through their actions. Low effortful control, the degree to which you are ill-disciplined and don't actually follow through. So almost low conscientiousness, a specific element of that. Manipulation, where you are just, nobody actually knows why you are behaving the way you are. You're not coming across as genuine. You manipulate other individuals emotionally most of the time to get your way. Negative effect, this is just experiencing and expressing negative emotions with all those around you. So it doesn't matter what's happening, you're not going to be a very happy person to be around. And same with pessimism. This is more long term. So again, even if something good happens, you're going to say, oh, that was just a strike of luck. Generally, though, things are not going to get better. Risk taking, the degree to which you seek intense and varied experiences in life. And rule defiance, like the name suggests, just breaking whatever rules you can for the sake of it. And these 12 behaviors in the development, Prof. Sale and Prof. De Bruin, they found that these 12 behaviors really did come up often. If we're looking at counterproductive work behavior, these are the behaviors that tend to come up most often. But then grouping these 12 behaviors, then that is where these indices come from. Remember on my previous slide, I said these indices also correlate very well with the hair psychopathy index. So if we're looking at attribution style, for example, there we would be combining external locus of control and pessimism. So you can imagine that combination, this individual, doesn't matter what goes wrong, they're not going to take responsibility for. Narcissist index, you can see I have the dark triad of personality over here, and you don't want this triad in your organization. It's not going to be a nice person to work with. But narcissism, here we are combining egotism and callous effect. So you are greater and better than everybody else. Machiavellianism index, here we're combining manipulation, cynicism, and callous effect. Really not caring about anybody else in the team, but just manipulating them to do what you want. Callous interaction, taking this Machiavellianism one step further, where we are taking manipulation, callous effect, egotism, and aggression. Again, so do what I say you need to do or face very uncomfortable consequences. Erratic lifestyle, this is more interpersonal than organization, but it can have organizational impact. This we combining risk-taking, impulsivity, rule defiance, and low effortful control. And lastly, in the risk, we call it the dispositional deviance, or if we're talking about the dark triad, this would be your subclinical psychopathy. Again, we are not calling a person a psychopath, though, if they do flag on this scale, but this is if you have both the callous interaction and the erratic lifestyle indexes flagged, then you'll also have dispositional deviance. Here's an example report. So the practitioner would be able to see if you're flagging on a multidimensional indices. Due to the very sensitive nature, we don't give this information in the candidate report, but our candidates would be able to see where they score on the risk, with anything above that 80th percentile being flagged openly as a high risk. Right. Moving very quickly then, so that is the risk. And if you are not yet trained, we do have a little bit of a Easter egg towards the end that we will share with you. But that's how you would interpret the risk in and of itself. But sometimes, though, I mean, we all have, nobody's perfect. So all of us have one or two risky behaviors that we can develop, where we can improve. And so what we've done with the sample of 19,500 people is just look at the prevalence. So how often do people actually flag on any particular scale? So if you are flagging on aggression, for example, that doesn't make you a horrible risk that you're just going to start hitting people. 22% of our sample overall do flag above that 80th percentile. Again, where the value of the risk really comes in is that prevalence of the indices being flagged, and also where you have more than 3 flags overall. So we all have one or two developmental areas, one or two behaviors that aren't great, that can cause some sort of discomfort. But once you start seeing individuals, if we're looking at the prevalence of number of scales on a profile, you can see that 50%, more than 50% of our sample have between 0 and 2 flags. And typically we find that when you're in this range, people don't really complain that you're a horrible person to work with. But once we go above that 3 flags, then this person is becoming a risk in the true sense of the word. We can also see when we're looking at these indices that as these indices become more and more deviant, for lack of a better word, the prevalence does decrease, which means this individual is becoming more and more of a risk. So if we're looking at attribution index, yes, there are people that are just negative to be around. They're not comfortable. You don't want to work with them, but they're not really going to cause harm. Once you start talking about narcissism or Machiavellianism, you can imagine the negative implications on the team or the organization, on their motivation and engagement in continuing to work with a team member that keeps taking all praise on behalf of the team. We will share these prevalence rates. I mean, this recording is available, but we'll also share the prevalence rates. Then if we're looking at job level trends, we'll also share this with you tomorrow. But if we're looking at the job level trends, we tend to find that employees as a whole, when we looked at our ANOVAs just to compare these different samples, employees tend to score higher on cynicism, negative affect, and external locus of control, which suggests that depending on, I mean, you have management above them and executives above them. So they might feel more disengaged in the role because they don't really have power. This is your sample that really just need to follow the rules. They might not actually understand why they are engaging in certain activities. The boss said so, so I need to behave this way. So if you are seeing higher cynicism or negative effects in an employee, don't, again, look at it within context. Don't just say, okay, this person is high on cynicism, I'm not going to select them. Often we find managers that their scores are in between your employees and executives. They're also in between from a job level perspective, but they tend to have the lowest impulsivity scores across the group. indicating more measured decision making, more tactical, hands-on, understanding the strategy, but also knowing what needs to be done. Executives tend to show the highest level of egotism, which might just be that, yeah, I mean, they are confident. They needed to show some form of competence to get to that executive level. They also show higher levels of risk-taking and rule defiance, which can be beneficial in some cases to break that status quo, to grow the company. But it also comes with, higher risk, higher reward, but higher risk, and the company goes bunk. If we look at, I'm going fast because you will get this in a handout, but industry trends, just for interest, we see that like your advertising and your retail markets actually have higher aggression scores because it is a competitive field that they are in. If you think of sales and branding and marketing, you have to be somewhat aggressive, not physically, but maybe a little bit verbally, like speak louder and get your point across compared to some other industries. If we're looking at corporate and public service, a lot of cynicism there, distrust in leadership. What are they actually doing? Impulsivity and risk-taking in your creative fields, risk-taking in particular, that kind of makes sense with the fields if we're talking about advertising and needing to be adaptable and change and come up with quirky selling lines. Rule defiance, again, in your creative and your high-stake roles, as mentioned previously, an external locus of control and job stability. So again, finding that individuals are working in, for example, industry and utilities or protective and public services, where regulations, there are so many regulations. We just go with what the rules say. It's not really in our control. So we see higher external locus of control there. Right, so there are a number of industry benchmarks available. Tomorrow we will be sending out a follow-up email with today's recording and a handout with all of the benchmarks. But if you don't get it, or if you would like these benchmarks in another form, maybe you'd like to benchmark your own organization to the industry benchmarks, please contact us at info@JBR Africa and we will assist there. But now over to the really fun stuff, Lisi's analysis with latent profile.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you just for this opportunity. I think firstly, I'm assuming that my screen is sharing, so I'm assuming that is fine. Firstly, this study was based on my master's thesis, and it was just such a privilege to work with this data. So I really want to say thank you to JBR for that. And also, of course, Professor Dion de Bruin was just instrumental in even just challenging me with this study. And it was quite a learning curve for us all. And I'm hoping you're going to find some interesting things here, especially if you've been using the risk and seeing it in a slightly new way. This was the title of my study, A Person-Centered Approach to Counterproductive Work Behaviour. And the method was then this latent profile analysis, where we are trying to identify personality types emerging from the risk. I think firstly, something that I just want to pick up on, Pakiza was sharing some of the stats regarding counterproductive work behaviour. In this, I might say deviant behavior or something like that, but I'm talking about counterproductive work behavior, and it's really that intentional, voluntary behavior. Someone's doing it on purpose, and it's undermining organizational objectives. But some of the cost is hard to determine. It's hard to measure. There's a lot of subjectivity there. It's a lot of incidences actually go unreported. We may have all sorts of scenarios that it's difficult to measure. Something like a bruised reputation. How do you measure that for a company? Or there's negligence happening. And it's not always easy to measure what's happening in terms of counterproductive work behavior. And because of this, there's a lot of indirect cost as well. There are actual physical costs just costing millions and millions of, a lot of times reported in US dollars. But the indirect cost of deviant behavior also then plays enormously into the organizational climate. What's it like to work for this organization? And you'll see things like high levels of stress, absenteeism, turnover, low morale, or just very poor job satisfaction, and probably you'll those things are just very hard to measure in what we have available to us. And just while I'm just on the topic of counterproductive or deviant behavior, I want to bring us back to some of the literature. What does the literature tell us about organization or deviant behavior? We know from the literature, we mostly look at counterproductive behavior on this dimension here at the bottom, where I'm indicating. It's kind of looking at the target of deviant behavior. It's either towards a person in the organization or then towards the organization itself. So there's this interpersonal deviance or organizational deviance dimension. And at the same time, we're looking at deviant behavior that's kind of super serious and like the more, we look potentially criminal activity here. But also lesser serious forms of deviant behavior. And I think this stuff can be very hard to measure. On the interpersonal side, we're looking at this political deviance quadrant. And it can be simply, things like your colleague gossiping about you, or there's gossip happening, or something like that. That's not necessarily yet at harassing and bullying, but it's absolutely affecting the environment. The climate. So what is it like to work for this organization? On the organizational deviance side, we have this quadrant called production deviance. And I was looking at that stat from Pakizo, over 50% or more or less there of people sending fake medical reports. That's like a way of withholding effort. You're robbing the organization from your productivity. So there's diminished quality and quantity of work. And these things can be very hard to measure. They're quite subjective in nature. And I'm hoping some of the material that we're going to cover today is going to just help us shed a bit of light on, can we know more about those personality profiles and also spot them when we measure for integrity. And just taking it back to my study, we kind of looked at counterproductive work behavior and realized there's a lot of information and there's a lot of literature looking at it from a variable-centered approach. And that's the idea that you are seeing how are the variables relating. Does trait anger predict the propensity for interpersonal deviance? And we're looking at the way variables, or let's talk about personality traits. How do traits relate to one another? How might they predict one another? What mediates that relationship, or what moderates that relationship? We've had enormous success just finding so much in this, and this is where the RISc was developed. But one of the limitations of looking at personality from a variable-centered perspective is we often actually, if we're putting on our scientist hat for a minute, these are often tests of statistical significance, if you remember Pearson's R. And that is only significant, a relationship will only be significant where there is significance across the whole sample. It's saying that trait relations are stable across the whole sample. And there's, you cannot actually see what's happening perhaps in the individual. The sample's made up of many people, and personality is so complex. We have many traits coexisting. Each one of us has a unique configuration of traits, and maybe we have a bit of anger in us, but we're not necessarily going to be egotistic or something. We may not necessarily act out verbally or physically in that anger, depending on what else is in our personality makeup. And what variable-centered approaches help us do is understand how the traits relate to one another on a group level, but it's hard to see what's happening on the individual level. So it's kind of making its focus, we're focusing on variables and we're focusing on the relationships and the associations of variables for a group at a time. So you're kind of looking at traits in a sense, almost in isolation, or just a few traits at a time. And it's at the group level inferred from this average probability for the sample. And what we're saying is the sample may be heterogeneous, meaning there may be subpopulations, different groups of people in the sample that may not, their trait relations isn't the way we expected. And then the group, your Pearson's R is not statistic, but it's actually because the traits are manifesting differently for each individual. So we wanted to look at personality and say, how can we look at this with all of the traits coexisting? So if we look even at Gordon Allport, you would remember his name from your studies. But he defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his or her unique adjustments to his environment. So what we're saying is there's something happening within the individual, and there's a uniqueness there that often with variable-centered approaches, we can't necessarily see what's happening with the individual. We see what's happening on the group level. But when we talk about these intra-individual, from that perspective, we can actually, there's other questions that we can answer with a person-centered approach. And the kind of question that comes up is, what do we know about types of persons? So we're now looking at individuals and not types of traits when we consider something like counterproductive work behavior. And this brings me to the focus of, or the approach that I took with my study, which is a person-centered approach. And we're talking now of the unit of analysis would be individuals or clusters of individuals. And this is a way of detecting those subpopulations within the sample. So we're not assuming the sample is homogeneous. We're assuming them, who knows, there might be different groups with unique or different personality types within the sample, and we want to see what comes up. So in that sense, it's more holistic. It's giving us that configuration of many variables in combination, and in this case, we're looking at personality. So a lot of traits coexisting. And we might see some unexpected things. This is just the nature of some of the person-centered approaches. And I think this was such a wonderful study to do and so enjoyable. And I think a lot of you are sitting on very interesting data that we could use this type of LPA or person-centered approach and see what types of people are sitting in whatever the data is that you have. But kind of person-centered approaches, we use it to answer different questions. So it's complementary to variable-centered approaches. But it answers different kind of questions. For instance, how many people, how many profiles are in the data? What is the prevalence of each profile? What kind of can predict the profile membership? Or what kind of outcomes can we see coming out of these profiles? What do they mean? And then we also want to make sure we have a good validity and good answers and see that the profiles replicate across samples and make sure that we've got robust answers there. So the latent profile analysis is the method my study took. LPA is basically, it's a mixture model-based statistical approach, which really it's embedded under generalized structural equation modeling. And what that really means is we are taking our model, we come up with our model, and that might be something like we think there might be 4 profiles in this data, or maybe there's 2 or 3, and we kind of test each model. How many profiles do we think there might be here? And we test each one and see which one will have the best fit according to a set of fit statistics. So, but what LPA does, it does this, it reveals those unobserved categorical profiles. So we're seeing those subpopulations within the sample. And then it's really looking at, like, it's trying to identify groups of people, groups of those participants, and it's trying to make distinct groups. So each group is different from every other group. And within the group, people look quite similar. So that's kind of where it's doing its algorithm. So in that sense, LPA is typological. It's looking for types or taxonomy, if you will. It's prototypical, which basically means there's a probability of latent profile membership. Maybe you get assigned to a certain profile, but that might not be with 100% accuracy. It can be, but maybe you don't fit the profile that well. Maybe it's a 80% fit, and it's important for us to keep that in mind, but I'll get into that a bit later. And LPA is exploratory. It's a very fun way of doing your research. If anyone's looking to do a master's thesis, I highly recommend this. There's a lot of things that you can use to just come up with your answers. But this is classic LPA criteria for identifying. If we're saying there are personality types embedded in this data set, how can we know that we're seeing something that works, that's a good typology? These are good answers for us. So we basically look for parsimony in our answers. We're not wanting a super complicated 20 profile situation. We want to keep it simple and able to interpret the results and use it, make it psychologically meaningful for us to use in practice. And of course, it's got to be theoretically defensible and of course valid. It's got to replicate across samples, so we know we're looking at proper profiles. And then just again to say, the profiles are probabilistic. Membership is fractional, which means there's a degree of fit. You may be assigned to a certain profile, and it's important then to look, well, how good is that fit? It adds also that dimensionality. We're not just doing solid categories. You are in this profile, but one can see, well, to what dimension or what degree is this a good classification? So a good fit would typically be at least 80% or higher, and acceptable still at 70%. Not every person will have an acceptable fit because personality is so complex. So we have to acknowledge that and then look out for that when we see people's results. But for our sample, for our analyses, we had excellent fit. Our entropy and posterior probabilities were excellent. So it meant most people, by far, only a very small percentage weren't properly allocated to a profile, but most of them were. Okay, and then I'm going to now share the magic. These are our 4 profiles. So you can see they are, okay, let me start here. Firstly, these are the scales. Okay, we're looking at the 12 risk scales here at the bottom. Aggression, low effort, for everything that Pakiza just explained. This is the risk. And then at the very end here on the right, these are the big 5, and that's measured by the the basic traits inventory. So extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness. So what we're seeing here are 4. We using our LPA criteria, we decided on a 4-profile solution as the best fit, psychologically meaningful, theoretically interpretable, and practically useful. And as you can see, we have a Mr. Very high risk here at the top in the green, this profile. And you see this person or this type, this personality type is quite high on most of the risk scales. I'll just point out this mild risk in purple. This person or this profile is almost entirely on the mean. So it represents your average. They're not well defined on any of the scales, but just to give us an indication where the average is. The high risk is quite far above the average. It dips down here for things like egotism. It goes way below the average for extroversion, for conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness. But then it's quite high on neuroticism in terms of the big 5. And we'll look into the high risk profile just in a bit more detail. But just to show you, those are the 4 profiles in terms of the prevalence. The high risk, that's about 7.2% of our sample. So fortunately, like the smaller percentage, potentially a risk for counterproductive work behavior. This moderate risk person, also a little bit higher on a lot of the scales. That's coming out at about 20.6% of the sample. And then I also want to point out this low risk. Let me just say, with a mild risk, most people fall into this category. That's 49% of the sample. So most people are just falling there. And then we have about 23.19% here in the low risk profile. And this is a profile that we can see according to the risk, very well adjusted, able to internalize anger, able to think positively and have positive emotions, and they don't break the rules. They're very optimistic, and they're very well adjusted. Even on the big 5, we see they just slightly over to extroversion, but low on neuroticism, and then very high on conscientiousness, and also high on openness and agreeableness. A very positive profile. I think for me, what I would want to see in future studies might this profile also be that personality that's also your high performer, and that person that's just adding a positive environment, adding to a positive environment at work and making life pleasant at work. But then, okay, so let's also just look at our entropy. I've put these stats there for us. The entropy and posterior probabilities are very good. So it's just showing, these are, most people fell into these profiles with high accuracy. Not everyone did, but mostly everyone did. So we can rely on these profiles. Okay, so when we look at the high risk, we just want to zoom in a little bit on this profile. Very well classified, 97.87%. That's the accuracy of which people, that 7.2% of the sample fell into this profile. They're very much characterized by aggression, these traits at the left here, like aggression, low effort control. So we're talking about that, difficulty managing anger, and they might act out in verbal or physical aggression. There's a tendency to be careless, to be ill-disciplined, unorganized, just not doing your that effort to achieve your goals. Moody, experiencing a tendency to experience negative emotions. You may even have depressive mood, but like a sadness and anxiety, guilt. So high on negative affect, very pessimistic outlook on life, kind of expecting the worst from life events, and that callous affect, it's on a continuum with empathy. So it's very low on empathy. It's kind of that cold, uncaring, and being indifferent to others. Even if what you did really hurt someone, it doesn't bother you so much. It's a really callous disposition. They're also quite high on neuroticism, and neuroticism, we know from the literature, is a great predictor of interpersonal deviance and organizational deviance. And then we see low levels of the rest of the big 5, specifically looking at conscientiousness and agreeableness. Conscientiousness is the strongest predictor of organizational deviance. And agreeableness, a very strong predictor, or it's more predictive of interpersonal deviance. But these 2 broad factors predict counterproductive work behavior very well in the literature. We've seen that over and over again. So from this sample, people were classified into this profile with high accuracy, but then as you would use the risk and see if someone falls into this profile, you would want to make sure that it is there's good accuracy, a good fit in terms of the profile, and then to look into what might be happening, you know, what other evidences or data do you have on the person. It's definitely worth a closer look. And then I also want to quickly look at the moderate risk profile. What's happening here, and then we're looking at this kind of bluish line over here, the moderate risk. So I want to say it's mostly characterized by this negative affect. So again, we're talking those negative emotions, anxiety, and also very high on neuroticism. Again, just that anxiety and just emotional instability, a profile with mostly those two characterized, but also high in aggression, quite high in cynicism, and just basically believing that people are dishonest and insincere. And you kind of, that's your expectation of people. Impulsivity as well. This is that idea of you're not able to self-regulate. You kind of act on your impulses, and you self-gratify. And then also quite high on rule defiance. And I want to say rule defiance, if we think about counterproductive work behavior, this is kind of the essence in many ways, because we're talking about people who are willing to break those explicit and implicit rules of society, or what would be appropriate in the organization and not appropriate. For them, that's not like a very clear line. It's, you know, they don't mind breaking those rules. Okay, so again, neuroticism is a known predictor for both interpersonal and organizational deviance. And then I'm going to now move away from the profiles and just talk about, well, what does this mean for us? What can we do with this? I think one of the things that, you know, just going forward, firstly, I think Pakiza will talk about how the profiles can be used along with the risk. But even just going forward, it would be so interesting and helpful to see, how do these profiles predict other outcomes, or what other variables, what other factors might predict profile membership. You know, you want to do those studies and see how the profiles relate to other things that are interesting to us. You know, can we say a high risk profile, we know there's a strong relationship between a high risk profile and, for instance, absenteeism. And I've listed a bunch of variables here that are of interest for us, especially in the counterproductive work domain, but also the flip side of that, you know, organizational citizenship behavior, because these things are, you know, they're kind of on the other side, you know, on a continuum, on the one side, very positive, on the other side, negative behaviors. And so we want to see, how do the profiles relate to, you know, even performance metrics? Can we, you know, can we see even from a low risk profile, are these our high performers? And in that sense, even the risk might give us that information if someone falls into a low risk profile. So it's always helpful to see, well, how do the profiles then relate further? And then, of course, from a scientific perspective, there's a lot of other studies you can do. I've just kind of wrote some of them down. Even as a practitioner, you might want to see what are other contextual factors that we can use in the way that we are, you know, how these profiles are relating. Can we change some of our policies, or what's even with a culture? You know, you can do all sorts of studies to just look at it from a contextual perspective. You can even do longitudinal studies and see, well, do people stay in the same profiles over a lifespan? You know, you may mature a lot in your life. Maybe someone was measured very high in aggression, but later on in life, they've calmed down quite a lot, and they're able to internalize that anger, and they may fall into a different profile. And we can do some of the longitudinal LPA studies as well, or even how do these profiles, do they remain the same across nationalities? Okay, and I think that's it from me. I want to say thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it back to Pakiza.
Thank you so much, Lisi. And I think everyone, what we're really hearing here is the value of research, and research again. What was so valuable here is the fact that we have, Lisi from University of Stellenbosch, independently looking at how risk can be used. Lisi, I think you can just see all of the hearts and claps coming your way. So really, really well done. And I
Thank
think
you.
just to conclude this, if you are already using the RISC, just way forward, because today we've discussed a whole lot of different things that necessarily wasn't in the training before, or the way you've used the RISC in the past. Maybe you haven't thought of prevalence or benchmarks, or now this latent profile analysis. So if you have used the RISC before, I think it was 30% that said yes. Remember the basics, that we still start with our multidimensional indices. Those are flagging our most destructive behaviors. Then we do want to consider your specific scales, especially in the context of something like the basic traits inventory, or whatever normal everyday trait occupational personality inventories that you are using. I think like geeking totally on the research. I mean, in the past, we have done correlations and convergence with the basic traits inventory, but the way Lisi's latent profile analysis showed it, right? I mean, innately, we know high conscientious, low neuroticism, or high emotional stability, likely that the person will have lower counterproductive behavior. But just the way it plays out, I think, as a JVR practitioner, I keep getting asked, should I use integrity or personality? If I'm using personality, do I still need something like the RISC? And I think we're just showing time and time again that each assessment does bring in its own unique value. There is definitely place for using both in your selection or development decisions. They just color in each other so beautifully. So even if you are currently using the RISC, don't discard your normal personality inventories either, but use it almost to triangulate and give further context to how your risk scales will play out in the workplace. Then consider your latent profile analysis. So, I mean, with Lisi now, we will be updating the manual. Maybe this recording or parts thereof will now be part of an updated training in future. So please don't let today's information be lost in translation. And I think you've heard it from Lisi multiple times, and hear it from us as well. Please partner with us in future research. We want to show that RISC is working in your organization, in your industry, with your people. If it's not working, it's not working. I think we need to also face those facts, and we find something that does work for you. But at the end of the day, as a country, we can agree that counterproductive work behavior is an issue. All the work that has been done on the RISC, which is a local assessment, has been shown to be very, very promising. But help us. Please share your performance data, your KPI data, your absenteeism data. I know it's sometimes difficult to share disciplinary data, but you know what? We'll sign all the non-disclosure agreements, or you can do the analysis yourself independently, and you can be like Lisi and present your research to us. So please see us as a partner to research and show the practical value of the RISC in your organizations and industries. And then that Easter egg that we promised earlier, if you're not currently using the RISC, or it's been a while, or you just haven't had a chance to do the training, everybody who is on this call, if you are not yet already trained, you are now eligible for 15% off the e-learning. So please take advantage of that and become RISC trained. Help us collect more data on it. Help us with those predictive studies. And I know I promised we would be done with 10 minutes to spare for more questions. That was not the case, but I don't think you mind. Lisi's part of this presentation was so meaningful. But yes, we would love one or two questions in the Q&A to answer that. And we will also be sending an email tomorrow with those benchmarks as promised, with today's recording and the CPD questionnaire, so that you can get that free CPD point as well.
Keys.
Everyone. Yes, Andrea.
We do have a question. We've got a participant asking, Are there any correlations between the risk and the Hogan derailers?
Yes, yes, there are. I don't have them on hand, but we'll just take down your details and we will forward them. So they're not, there are correlations. I must say they are on the weaker side, purely because if we think of from a pure theoretical perspective, the risk is a behavioral trait. So like we're looking at your 5-factor model, and those are behaviors that you share every day. That you show every day. Your personality is your personality. Likewise, the risk looks as those counterproductive behaviors that tend to come out in your everyday behavior. If we are looking at the HDS, I am seeing in the chat more people are asking, so we'll just amend the email that's sent for tomorrow to add that risk and HDS correlation table for you. But from a pure theory perspective, risk are those everyday negative behaviors that come up, like your normal conscientiousness, your normal neuroticism. That aggression and that rule defiance comes out daily. If we're looking at the HDS, remember, so that is based on what personality traits come out if you're overusing it or underusing it, when you're under stress, when you're very, very bored. It's a trait activation model. It's not an everyday behavior. So because the underlying theory is different, yes, there are correlations. Egotism is bold, Like we see those relationships, but they aren't like a 0.7 or 0.8. We do have clients who do use both the RISC and the HDS in their batteries, because they do give different insights to different forms of counterproductive behavior. Hope that answered, but we will send the correlations. Right, I see another question from Andrea, not our Andrea, another Andrea. We don't have Giotto and RISC because Giotto isn't our product. We are more than willing to collaborate with you. So if there are studies where if you have used the Giotto and now want to use the RISC or vice versa, please share that data with us. We can also speak with the developers of Giotto if that would help. But let's look at your sample and the unique value that both the Giotto and the RISC provide to your organization. Geraldine? There's somebody else, or Geraldine?
Pakisa, I see someone's also asked, how would you use the RISC for developmental purposes?
Yes, so again, I'm not sure what your battery is, but if you know a person's like normal everyday personality profile and what the strengths are there, if you maybe have an EQI or a TQ or some sort of emotional inventory as well, maybe it is that, you know what, their strengths and their emotional stability and other social skills are that good that you can then, in the feedback with them, highlight that, you know what, yes, the RISC highlights that these things are not great. We need to work on this. But then let's use your personality and EQ strengths for development. So if you see one of your risks are starting to come out, how can we rely on your strengths? Not sure, Geraldine, we're trying to unmute you.
Yeah, I'm also trying to press buttons to see if I can get Geraldine to give her a voice.
Somebody's asking the cost of the course. I think it's in the range of 6,000. It is also a self-report, self-paced, that time of day, self-paced course. So you can do it over a weekend if you want. You can do it, it's not a training that you have to come to JVR for and sit in learning. It's self-paced. We will share all of that information in the follow-up email tomorrow.
We have another individual asking, speaking of EQ and risk, how should you explain high range optimism on EQ, but pessimism high on risk?
That is very interesting. That is very interesting. I mean, from at the top of my head, I would say, okay, fine, there's something going on there. The first thing I would check for is impression management, since the EQ does have that. Is there a positive impression happening there? And then I would look at both the EQ and the risk and actually look at their response styles. Are they just saying strongly agree and agree to everything, or vice versa, strongly disagree and strongly disagree to everything? So I would probe that, because that doesn't make sense. We have actually looked at the EQ and the risk before, and that correlates. We're supposed to see a negative correlation there between optimism and pessimism. Geraldine, I'm so sorry that we can't unmute you. Wanda, maybe try putting the question, if it's not too long, put it in the chat and we'll try to respond. Otherwise, I think we have your email address, and you have ours, so contact us that way. Okay, I think we're moving. Geraldine, you're unmuted.
Oh,
No, not unmuted. I saw you for a second.
I don't see any other questions while we wait for Geraldine.
Thanks again, everyone, and a huge thank you to Lisi for your research. It was absolutely impactful, and the fact that it's independent just adds credibility. So thank you so much for taking that on. Any other masters and PhD students on the line, please also get in touch. We'll happily share data with you as well.
Great. No, that was my pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Jody. Super. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.